is something I'm not really used to. So I'll just begin at the beginning. You can choose your friends, but you can't choose your relatives, right? So as I go through this and talk about different people in my family history, it sounds kind of weird, almost like I'm bragging, but that's another reason that makes me nervous. But it is really fun. Everybody has a story to tell. It doesn't matter who you are, where you came from. It can be heroic, it can be tragic, it can be romantic, it can be famous, it can be unknown, but everybody has a story to tell if you take the time to listen to it. And our ancestors had these stories too. We are a nation of immigrants. We're all descended from immigrants. Some of us might have a little American Indian in them, but basically we're all immigrants. And I think anybody who's an immigrant here has taken on a huge challenge with a lot of guts and a lot of perseverance to get here, no matter how they did it. And that's one of the things that gives them all the stories to tell. I've been very fortunate in that my mother's family has recorded and maintained a lot of the family history over the years. She is from Virginia, and a lot of her family has lived in the central part of Virginia for a long time. And in fact, she lives in a house that's been in my family since 1830 when it was built. And it's been passed down from generation to generation, always through the women. Interesting. And so a lot of the history is preserved that way because people have stayed in the same place and the house. But my mom's tree actually goes all the way back to the nation's first immigrants, the Mayflower. So the Pilgrims were actually called saints. They called themselves saints. They didn't like the Church of England and they didn't like the Catholic Church because they thought they were both corrupt and idolatry and all that kind of stuff they didn't like. So they wanted to be free to worship the way they wanted to. Well, the Church of England was ruled by the king, so you had to worship in his church. So they picked up and left in like 1608 and went to Holland. And there they were able to worship the way they wanted to, which was great, except for the fact because they weren't Dutch, they couldn't work in the guilds. They had menial, low-paying jobs, and it was a freer society, and their kids were starting to get caught up in more cosmopolitan lifestyle. So they were like, hold on, this is not good for us either. Let's start off and create a fresh new start in a brand new world. So they went back to England, got their act together, got a charter from the Virginia Company to come to the New World. So they started out on 2 cargo ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell, in September, and the Speedwell immediately sprung a leak. So they went back, and 102 people and all their stuff packed onto the Mayflower. So the Mayflower is, and I was trying to come up with something that would compare. The Mayflower is about as long as 2 school buses and about as wide as 3 school buses next to each other. So think about that. 2 school buses, 3 school buses, and 102 people and all their stuff packed on it. And they left later than they wanted to because of that leaky Speedwell ship. So they got caught in all the storms in the North Atlantic, got blown off course, didn't wind up anywhere near the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay or the Hudson. They wound up in Cape Cod. On the trip over, one person who was not one of the saints, the religious group, got washed overboard, but one person also gave birth. So they still landed with 102 people. Didn't find anything here except like an abandoned Indian village. They didn't know where they were. They tried to head south. The weather kept pushing them back. So here they were stuck in the Massachusetts Bay for the winter. So over the course of the winter, they had a lot of disease. They stayed on board the ship. A lot of people got sick and died, and only 53 people survived. So out of 102, 53 people survived. 26 of those people from that original ship wound up having descendants, or people in couples, because sometimes the husband and wife both survived. But of 26 people and individuals and couples that survived that sailing, that landing, that first foray into the American wilderness, only 26 had descendants. But according to the Mayflower Descendants Society, they now have 35 million descendants across the world. 10 million here in the United States. So it seems like it's such a small number, but if any of you can trace your family back as far as I can, then we're cousins probably. I am actually directly descended from Governor William Bradford. He was the one that was the governor of the ship, signed the Mayflower Compact, and was the governor on and off for like 30 years. His first wife actually died right after they got here. So I'm not descended from her, but the next one. So I have a quote from him, because he did a lot of writing. He actually wrote this book called Of Plymouth Plantation, which is his firsthand account of the sailing and the establishment of the Plymouth colony. And he wrote, "As one small candle may light 1,000, so the light here kindled hath shown to many, yea, in some sort to our whole nation." And I thought that was really cool, because he was one of those lights, one of those 26 people that now has millions of descendants. William Bradford is my 10th great grandfather. I actually have my ancestry.com screen where it comes from William to Thomas to Jerusha to Silas to Daniel to Irene to Franklin Stearns to Irina Louisa, I'll mention them later, to Franklin to Francis to Mildred to me. I'm also descended from another early settler. He also came from England in the early 1600s and immigrated to the Boston area in about 1631. His name was Roger Williams. He's also my 10th great grandfather. So Roger Williams was a very religious man, and he came over for the same reason as the people who called themselves saints that we came to call pilgrims. And he came up, when he came over, he was extremely religious, and he had very unusual views for the time. He thought that the pilgrims, or the people that came to the Americas, should pay the Indians for their land and not just take it over. Pilgrims were a little shocked at that, and certainly the King of England would not have agreed. He also thought there should be a separation between church and state, because in England, there was that Church of England, which is why the pilgrims left in the first place. That was still kind of a foreign concept. So he was actually quite radical in his day to have this separation of church and state and pay the Indians for this land. So he was in Boston. They kind of kicked him out of the church for these things. So he went to Plymouth and they accepted him, and he wrote this treaty stating these things. And then they were like, whoa, you're trouble. So they actually charged him and were going to take him to court, but it was October. So they were going to take him to court in the spring. He slipped away in the middle of a blizzard and spent the winter living with the Indians. He went on to move to Rhode Island and established the Rhode Island colony, which became the state of Rhode Island. The interesting thing about him is he was one of the people the founding fathers based their ideals on, the idea that there should be separation between church and state. When he founded Rhode Island and they had their original colony, he thought everybody should get a vote and make it a democratic vote on certain issues that affected the colony. That was also unheard of. So the democratic vote and the separation of church and state were two things from Roger Williams that the founding fathers took away and put into our current government years later. So we come down a bunch of generations. As I said, they were both my 10th great grandfather, and they weren't related to each other, but as you come down, they actually had two kids that married each other eventually and came down through my line. And my mom's family, as I said, lives in this house that's descended from both of these people, lives in Virginia. And the house was built in 1830 and burnt down at the end of the Civil War. When they rebuilt it from bricks made on the property. And they rebuilt it 4 bricks thick because they weren't going to have a house burned down again. The cool thing about having a house in the family so long is you wind up with family heirlooms. So we have things like, let's see, I have some pictures I can share. So there's my mom's house, built 4 bricks thick. From the side. See, the columns were original. So when the house burned down, the 2 outside columns stayed, the rest of it burned, but those 2 were from the 1830 house. So one of the things that we've had in this house is this family Bible. It's actually a Bible with the front, Holy Bible, and it has all the Bible verses and chapters and everything in it. But in the beginning, there's this family record where you can keep track of all of your family births, deaths, children, events, all of those kinds of things. So we're very fortunate to actually have this personally handwritten record of our family history in this Bible. One of the other things we have is portraits. So this is my great 6th, 7th, if my sister's on here, she'll correct me, grandfather named Jeremiah Morton. He basically owned all of Orange County, Virginia. He was a congressman. He was an attorney. He was also a slave trader, a farmer, a planter. He owned the land that this house was built on, and he sold it to his daughter and son-in-law. His daughter, Millie, her portrait hangs in the back parlor. His portrait hangs in the front parlor. Hers is in the back parlor. She was about 16 when this was painted. It was painted by a German guy who was painting and teaching and living nearby in Fredericksburg, because this is down in Orange County, Virginia. And he was painting portraits for the practice and to make money. And eventually he then went on to school in Philadelphia, and then he went back to Germany and he painted a painting that you guys might have heard of called Washington Crossing the Delaware. His name was Emanuel Lutz. So she married a guy from New Jersey. He had come from New Jersey before the Civil War. His name was Joseph Jackson Halsey, went by JJ. And he came down to be a teacher, married a woman, and she died 6 weeks later from a fever. Well, in the course of courting her and marrying her, he met a number of members of her family. And a year later, he actually wound up marrying her cousin, Millie, the girl in the portrait. So the Civil War broke out and they lived in that house. She would lock herself in the basement at night as soon as it got dark. He went off as a soldier whose job was foraging for the army because he knew the area so well. He eventually became a lawyer. Everybody survived the war. There's a lot of stories around that period of history in my family that it's too much to tell tonight. And then about 10 or 15 years ago, somebody decided to research his family in New Jersey because they'd written a whole lot of letters back and forth during the war. So he came down to Virginia once to research my ancestors' letters, and he actually wound up writing a book, which it's my great-grandfather. So if my mom wrote in the front some of his fiction, because he did do a lot more research on the North and the South. And it's kind of a shame. If he had done as much research on the South, it would have been really riveting. It's a little lopsided. And that's my personal point of view of being related to the guy who got short shrift. But at any rate, he actually had a law office built on the front of the property, which still stands today. It didn't burn down when the house burned down. So the house has a smokehouse, an ice house, a law office, a graveyard where I will be someday. My dad's there along with a lot of other relatives. And my mom, well, I don't know what's gonna happen to it next, but we'll see. So that's my mom's side. Oh, one more thing. Because JJ, this guy, became a lawyer and he lived in the South. When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, it wasn't actually a legal document. It was more of a policy, a pronouncement. This is how I want it to be, not legally. But that didn't stop him from sending a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation to every single attorney in the South. He wanted to get his message across. So he sent it to every lawyer in the South. So our copy is in a safe deposit box. signed by William Seward, who was the Secretary of State at the time. Yeah, I used to have a photocopy of it, not a long story. I don't anymore, but I'm gonna get a new one. So that kind of ties into the Lincolns, and we're gonna take a trip back to England in the 1600s again. Samuel Lincoln was born in England in 1612, and he immigrated to the colonies in 1637. You see a theme here? This is all way back there in the early 1600s. And he's considered the patriarch of the Lincolns in the New World. So he came over as a weaver's apprentice as a teenager. His great-grandson, I'm skipping a couple generations, was born in New Jersey and then wound up moving to Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and then wound up purchasing land in the Shenandoah Valley in 1768. It was, I think, Augusta County. Now it's Rockingham County. So he built his farm there and had all of his children there. So I have, that house also burned down. It seemed to be a problem back in the day. So he had a couple of sons. One of his sons, Jacob, built this house, which I got to go see last spring. It was awesome. Somebody had bought this house and they were starting to renovate it. They actually have an Instagram page and a Facebook page that I follow now, and they've done a couple of tours, and I wasn't able to go, but they have a tour coming up in a couple of weeks. I think it's their last one. Totally restoring it with love, with original wood, with original colors, everything, architectural details. It's amazing. They're doing a fantastic job. But in addition to the house here, they have, there's the side of the house. From a distance, you can see how big it is. It goes back. It's one of those L-shaped things. They have a graveyard that sits here on top of the hill in Rockingham County. Here's the house way back over here in the corner. And they have a map here that shows you who all the graves are. So this is John Lincoln. And here's the graves. It was actually kind of awe-inspiring to be there. And what a peaceful place to rest, right? Oh, there's the adorable one. Yeah, we'll stop there. I'll pull my family tree back up. So John and Rebecca had a couple of kids. One of them was named Abraham, and he fought in the Revolutionary War. So we'll call him Captain Abraham. So he built a house across the creek from his parents, which I said is not that one. That wound up being Abraham's brothers because his parents burned. So he built a house across the creek for himself. And then he decided to move further west. I tell you, these immigrants, they have this adventurous spirit. They're always moving, always going, and they have the guts to pick up and go. There was something I read that said he was just a friend of Daniel Boone who had encouraged him to go west. So he went further west into Virginia, which is now what we would call Kentucky, but back then it was part of Virginia, and set up another farm. So Captain Abraham, the farm is, let's see, in Jefferson County, about 20 miles east of Louisville. So the Native Americans are in the area across on the Ohio River. So everybody around that area would settle near forts, and he was near the Hughes Station on Floyd Fork. So they began clearing land and doing the farming and all of that. So he had 3 sons and 2 daughters, and his sons were Mordecai, Josiah, and Thomas. Well, one day, Mordecai, who was about 14, and Josiah, who was maybe 11, and Thomas, who was about 7, were working with their dad in the field when an Indian came out of the woods and killed their dad right in front of them. So Mordecai, being the oldest, ran back to the cabin and got a rifle and loaded it. Josiah ran to Hughes Fort for help, and Thomas stood there next to his father's dead body in shock. The Indian grabbed Thomas and was either going to kill him, kidnap him, don't really know what his intentions were, but it's okay because Mordecai raised his rifle and fired and killed the Indian where he stood. So eventually, Thomas grew up. He married a woman named Nancy Hanks, and he had a couple of kids, and he named one of them Abraham after his father. Mordecai grew up. He also got married. He also had a kid he named Abraham for his father, and he had several other kids. He had 6 altogether. So Mordecai had a daughter. He married a woman named Mary Mudd. We'll come back to that in a second. He had a daughter named Elizabeth. Elizabeth got married and had a daughter named Mary Loretta. Mary Loretta had a daughter named Olivia Ann. Here we are with all the girls again, another theme going through my family. Olivia Ann had a daughter named Maddie Alice, who had a daughter named Hazel Olivia, who had a son named Edward Francis. And Edward Francis had 4 kids, Beth, Ken, Sue, and Amy. Suzanne. So Mordecai is my 5th great grandfather, which makes me first cousins to President Abraham Lincoln, 6 generations removed. It's actually really kind of overwhelming when you think about it, that to have that kind of a brush with history. It's kind of sad though, when you realize that Abraham Lincoln himself has no living descendants. So here's 26 people from the Mayflower with millions of descendants. But Abraham Lincoln had siblings. They didn't have any kids. He had 4 children, only 1 married. They had some kids. They had a son and a daughter, and nobody had any descendants. So here's Samuel Lincoln, the first one that came over. This is John and Rebecca, whose graves we saw. This is Abraham, who died by the hand of the Indian. Thomas, his son, who was saved by Mordecai. Abraham married Mary Todd. They had 3 children, but Abraham had 1, 2, 3, 4, and none of these 3 married. Robert Todd had 1, 2, 3 kids. She married, had 2 kids. He didn't have any, and they had 1, and they married, and he didn't have any. So the last known descendant of Abraham Lincoln himself was Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, who died in 1985. Abraham Lincoln said, "The story of his death by the Indians," referring to his grandfather, "and of Uncle Mordecai, then 14 years old, killing one of the Indians, is the legend more strongly than all others imprinted on my mind and memory." He also remarks that Uncle Mord ran off with all the talents in the family. So that was kind of funny too. So when Mordecai married Mary Mudd, just as an aside, she was a first cousin twice removed from Dr. Samuel A. Mudd. If you know that name, Dr. Samuel A. Mudd was the one who was charged as a co-conspirator with John Wilkes Booth because he operated on his legs after John Wilkes assassinated Abraham Lincoln, and then broke his leg, and he went to Dr. Mudd's farm and he treated him, and there is some evidence he was actually involved in a conspiracy with him. That's where John Wilkes knew to go. That was down in Calvert County, I believe. So yeah, I'm related to the Mudds as well. This is all a little odd because I feel a little bit like Forrest Gump. You've got Abraham Lincoln, you've got Rogers, you've got Bradford, you've got Emmanuel Lutz, you've got the Mudds. There's also things. My mom is a piano as well. It's one of the oldest Steinways in the world. They had a contest a few years ago to find the oldest Steinway, and the person who actually has the oldest Steinways in Texas, but I saw that it was auctioned off. The Smithsonian has one of the oldest, but the inner workings were all redone. And so ours is the 2nd oldest in the country, I think. And one of my cousins once took it out of the house because after his grandmother died, he thought he should have it. But he brought it back almost immediately because it played in the middle of the night. Again, another story that has to do with Mom's house. But that is how I'm related to Abraham Lincoln. And it's a fascinating story. And I feel like, yeah, I don't want to brag, but it is fascinating. And I think everybody can learn so much from history. And when it's your personal history, it's even more compelling. I'm not sure if knowing all of this has given me a love of history, or my love of history has made me delve into more of this than most people would. I know somebody's going to come on in a couple of weeks or in a month who talks about genealogy. I'm not the genealogist. Other relatives have been. My sister's the one that does a lot. We've had a lot of family letters that she's transcribed. She does a lot of the genealogical research, like looking up details on things like that. She just happened to tell me today, yeah, Carl Sernenberg mentioned the story about Mordecai and Thomas in his biography. I'm like, I didn't know that. So I'm still learning stuff new every day. And you guys can learn something new too. Anybody can start researching their family and find out interesting stories. And it doesn't have to be famous, just stories of perseverance and triumph, especially as immigrants. No, right there. Any comments in here?
I can read some of the questions from the chat if you're ready for them. I see one of the first questions is, have you done any DNA tests, Ancestry or FTDNA? Pretty cool path to try and follow.
Actually, I did do Ancestry.com because my dad always had high cheekbones and he was from the Midwest. So we didn't find out about his family history until later. A cousin of his started doing research when he retired. So my dad would be 91 if he were still alive. So this cousin is about that same age. So he just started doing his family history about 20 years ago. So that's about the time we found out about the Lincoln connection. We haven't always known this. We've always known my mom and the Mayflower, but we didn't always know about the Lincoln connection. But my dad had, and this isn't the best picture to show it, but my dad had high cheekbones and dark eyes. And we always sort of wondered if maybe he didn't have American Indian in him coming from the Midwest. He grew up poor in Iowa, the oldest of 6 kids. His mom died when she was pregnant with number 6. And in later years, as I said, this isn't the best picture. My dad actually has a striking resemblance to this guy on the right, who is Thomas Lincoln, who's Abraham's father. He had the same mouth, the same chin, the same nose, the same deep-set brown eyes. It's harder to see in the younger picture of my dad, but it was kind of uncanny the first time I saw a picture of Thomas Lincoln. But yeah, I did do the Ancestry.com because I thought it would be cool to see if there was any American Indian. And no, there was no American Indian, but I did have a bunch of Scandinavian in me. And so I figured they must have been Vikings conquering the English, because as far as we know, we're all from England, maybe a little Ireland, maybe a little Scottish, maybe a little French, but you heard most of my tree, it's English. So I had more Scandinavian than I expected. I had no Irish and no American Indian. And they refined those results over the years. So I did mine maybe 5 years ago. And so every year or so, as they get more and more data, they do refine those results. So now I'm much less Scandinavian than I was the first time. And I do have a tiny bit of Irish in there. I've had a couple of people who reach out to me. We have some cousins we didn't know anything about that are related to my great grandfather, who apparently wasn't faithful to his wife. So there are great things you can learn from DNA, and there's some things that might throw you for a loop every once in a while. My sister did both. My sister did Ancestry.com and she did 23andMe, because 23andMe will also tell you health things, like if you're predisposed to different genetic diseases like Alzheimer's or macular degeneration or something like that. So she did both and compared them, and then we compare each other's. And even though we're full sisters from the same parents, we're slightly different. Like she might be 60% English where I'm 62% or whatever.
We can take more questions in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask them as well. I would be curious, in all of your research of your ancestors and genealogy, what's something that stuck out to you the most as maybe something you recognize in yourself and your family?
Oh, something I recognized in myself. The willingness to try something new, I think. I had the same job for over 20 years. And then when that kind of ended, I went and did something else, and I went and did something else. And I actually had somebody tell me once, you know, a little bit about a lot of things. I'm like, yeah, that's a nice way of saying jack of all trades, but I'm not an expert in anything. And I don't think these guys were experts in anything. They were weavers, they were farmers, they were planters, they were lawyers, they all had multiple things that they did. They weren't just any one thing, and they were always evolving. I mean, Abraham Lincoln really was born in a one-room schoolhouse with a dirt floor. His father, Thomas, was not all that into education. He made him work. He farmed him out to other people who needed labor. His mother was the one that stressed education, and when she died of like a milk poisoning sickness or something, it got worse for Abraham. And maybe that's why he adored his uncle Morty more, because his dad was his dad and his uncle wasn't, you know. But I think his uncle Mordecai was more into the education and everything. But it's the always willing to keep going, to go somewhere else, to learn something new, to add to your skill set. It just sort of blows me away that, but for that tiny little twist of fate, there would have been no President Abraham Lincoln. But for that one bullet, we wouldn't be who we are today. That one Indian, that one person that no one will, I don't even know what tribe he's from, could have changed the course of our history if we hadn't had that president. And that I always find so fascinating, a bit overwhelming. And who's going to be that person now, today, doing something? I think about that sometimes with my own kids. Just, you know, the person they saved, the accident they didn't have, the harm averted is benefit unseen. What didn't happen that would have affected the arc of history?
Suzanne, this might be a question for your sister, but but have you come across the Library of Virginia's online archive for Chancery court records?
I have not. She might have. I will tell you that in my mom's house, because as I said, we lived there so long and there was so much stuff saved. Where are my pictures? Here's the law office that did not burn down. It was built in the Greek temple style. So JJ had a lot of books and everything in here. So a lot of his stuff in this law office didn't burn down when the house did in 1869.
Oh, that's neat.
Yeah, and when my parents had it redone, so this thing on the front is a bit of the old original plaster when they had it replastered and they put the AC in. So there were a lot of legal books, a lot of old records, a lot of letters. We had a lot of family records. So my grandmother, when this building started to leak, maybe in the 80s, 70s, 80s, donated a whole bunch of stuff, boxes and stuff of letters to UVA. And they have been sorting and categorizing and everything. And it's the part of the library where you have to like put on the gloves and go in without anything but, you know, a piece of paper and a pen or something. Like it's a secure area. So we had a whole bunch more letters. My sister's been transcribing them for decades now, and she types them up and she has them in binders with a copy of the original letter and then the typed version. So anybody who wants to read it can read it. And they're in chronological order and they're fascinating. I would love to do a book with her someday. And she just a few days ago, she drove back up to Charlottesville and donated this whole stack of letters that hadn't been donated previously that she was working on.
Oh, that's cool.
There's all kinds of stuff, like there was a letter in there. So when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Appomattox, my Jeremiah Morton, the father of the man who owned these, he owned a lot of different properties. He owned a house he lived in, Morton Hall. Then he had another piece of land that was called Moorland, a house there. Then he had one that was called Stillmore. Then this one was called Lesland because it was the smallest. And they also owned one down near Appomattox, or Appomattox Courthouse. When the war ended, he had nothing. He didn't even have Morton Hall left because he had invested everything in Confederate war bonds. But there's a letter from a relative who lived down in that house at Appomattox, who was just relieved beyond belief that the surrender did not take place at their house, because it was either going to be their house or the McLean house, and they went to the other one. And she was so relieved that the surrender of the Confederacy did not take place at her house. I, on the other hand, think that would have been another cool story. But that's where most of our documents are, is at the University of Virginia Library.
Yeah, the neat thing about these Chancery archives is it's searchable by county and by surname. And if you're trying to look into enslaved folks, you can actually check a box and it'll only pull up court cases that involved enslaved folks. But I found stuff back into the 1820s. I mean, it's the actual scans of the handwritten court documents from, well, in some cases back into the late 1700s for an entire county. And the stuff I've found, my family doesn't have the best court reputation after reading through all these court cases, but it's really cool to check it out, to see what it covers. Divorces, it covers child custody, estate settlements, because when you had families as big as they had back in those days,
Right.
usually somebody didn't agree with how the estate was distributed, and they'd go through court cases that lasted years.
Or
It's
everything
really-
would go to the oldest son.
Right.
When
right.
Captain Abraham was killed by the Indian, Mordecai, my ancestor, inherited the farm, and Josiah and Thomas were on their own, which may
Right.
have been one reason why Thomas was more of a manual laborer, because he didn't start out with that advantage that Mordecai had.
Yeah.
Well, we had slaves as well. It's not something I'm proud of. It's just a fact.
Well, you can't measure your ancestors with today's morals, I don't think. You just
No,
have to.
and just like you can't take credit for being related to any of these cool famous people, you can't take credit for being related to people who owned other people. But this picture does hang in the front parlor of my mom's house. Not the back parlor, not in a box, not hidden away. These are my ancestors.
Wow.
And apparently having photos of slaves, especially when you know who they are, is extremely rare, because slaves were property. They weren't people. So the fact that there's actually a picture and it's been hanging in the house as long as anyone can remember gives me a little bit of hope that perhaps they were treated more like people than property.
It's really fascinating, some of the different artifacts that you've talked about and the ways that personal family genealogy can really add so much more context and interest to history that we know. Of all of the artifacts that you've encountered, like studying your family's history, which one sticks out to you the most as your absolute favorite?
Ooh, this is not set up. You didn't even know that I had a good answer for this question. I had no idea you were going to ask. Okay, so all those books that used to be in that library, that the law office separate from the house, we brought into the main house, and we set up these long tables in the basement, and we started sorting and we started categorizing. And so I was going through with the gloves on and everything, dividing the books by category: law book, gardening book, novel, Bible, Latin. They were all different topics. They were all very well educated. I don't know if they were self-educated or had governesses or something, but there were a lot of educational type books in there. So when Mildred and JJ lived in this house during the Civil War, I briefly mentioned, she locked herself and her 3 sons in the basement while her husband was off at war. And her husband wrote her letters saying, beware of the marauding soldiers on both sides. Both sides. He didn't trust any of them. They had 2 daughters who were 14 and 16, who were in boarding school in Fredericksburg. So she had them come home from school, and she had a woman that she knew that they called Dizzy Miss Lizzie, who would ride her carriage around, take her 2 daughters in her carriage through the Confederate line, through the Yankee line, to the train station in DC, and put them on a train to New Jersey to live out the war with her husband's New Jersey relatives. Not even knowing for months whether they had even made it, until she finally got a letter under a flag of truce from them. I don't know any mom who can do that and not just be terrified, but she was more terrified that something bad would happen to her teenage daughters. When I was helping my mom with these books and I'm going through sorting them, this one book I opened up and it had 2 coils of dark brown hair. And I looked at the copyright date in the front, and of course it predated the Civil War. It was like 1830 when the type of the book or whatever. And I was like, oh my God, I know what this is. She cut off a lock of her daughter's hair of each of them before she put them in Miss Lizzie's carriage to go to DC. And they've been pressed in that book for 150 years until I opened it up. It made me cry, and it gives me chills today. That is the coolest thing. I mean, having a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation is pretty cool, but this was just so personal.
That's one of my favorite artifacts. I've got, it's a little old time cigarette paper folder from the 1800s that somehow my granddad got, and he never threw it away. God bless him. But it's a lock of hair that was wound into a braid of my second great grandmother when she died. And it's got her name written in it, real gorgeous script cursive, with her birth date, because she was like 64 when she died. And she coincidentally passed like the month after her birthday. So it's got her name, her birth date, and then the date she died and her age. But that's just the coolest thing that I was lucky enough to have passed down.
It's
nowhere near
like,
anything.
it's a tangible piece of history. I mean,
Totally.
that is so cool. You can actually reach out and touch her in a sense.
Feel free now to unmute and ask any more questions you have or send them in the chat. I think it would be so fascinating to have an event one time where everyone just kind of brings their little piece of history and talks about it. I absolutely love these events that we have, learning about people's personal history. It's so fascinating to hear it through that up close lens instead of in the broader way that you learn it growing up.
And if it weren't for these histories and these stories, you wouldn't be here. I was talking to Maria, she's on here, last week saying, yeah, I don't know if I could talk for like 45 minutes just about the Lincoln story, but there's a lot of little stories in my history. I said, but you have a story too. I'm sure everybody has a story. And she said, yeah, my grandfather was in Yugoslavia during the war and in World War II, and how he escaped and other relatives were killed. And I'm like, yes, oh my gosh, it was, she started telling me her story. It's fascinating. I love hearing other people's stories, because everybody's got a story to tell if you just take the time to listen. And you can learn from them.
Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing your stories with us tonight. I hope everyone enjoyed tonight's presentation as much as I did and learned something new. Of course, if you think of any questions you have later, you can always email us at info@poolesvilleseniors.org and we can pass them along for you. If you'd like to unmute or turn on your camera now to say goodbye, now's the time. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, please leave a like and a comment. We'd like to thank Suzanne so much for this presentation, as well as our ongoing sponsors and private contributors that help us keep our programs going because we love putting them on for you. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, please consider joining us for upcoming events. This time next week, we'll be back with Kenny Scholl's July Historic Property Lecture. We missed it last month, so we're excited to be back this week. You can register at our website, poolesvilleseniors.org, for more info and registration. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks for
Suzanne. It was
having me.
great.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
It was
Yay.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Beautiful presentation.
Yeah, Thanks
was
for having
great.
me.